All Talk with Tom Jordan and Kevin Dietz on 760 WJR.
We've heard it time and again, and we've heard it again this week, last week, the week prior, the year prior to that the number one message we hear from the left is that they are fighting in this election against a threat to democracy. Progressives. It's a bit oxymoronic because what is progressivism in the first place? Former Attorney General Bill Barr, I don't know if you saw this, he did, I think, a great job at explaining how progressivism in the far left is the actual real threat to democracy. And he did this and he explained it in a pretty hostile environment on CNN with the news anchor Kaitlan Collins, who went back and forth with the former Attorney General. Collins was arguably feigning her dismay at how William Barr, who was just insulted by Donald Trump, could possibly cast a vote for someone who insulted him. Here's how Bill Barr responded.
I feel I have to choose Trump.
But he's mocking you.
So it's not about me.
So what? That was brilliant. Yeah, okay, Donald Trump insulted him. Who cares? It's not about him. It's not about our feelings or who gets insulted. It's about the real threat to democracy, and that is, without a doubt, progressivism.
I think a lot of people hear that, and the case that we just talked about that went before the Supreme Court, essentially, and say, how can you see that and say that Biden is a greater threat to democracy?
Well, where are we losing our freedoms? How are our freedoms being constrained? They're being constrained by the progressive government. And, democracy, especially, from the Anglosphere democracies, the Five Eyes and so forth, the threat's never been for autocratic government on the right.
But how specifically is Biden threatening democracy? The
threat to freedom and democracy has always been on the left. It's the collectivist, socialist agenda. And that is where we're losing our freedom. Parents are losing the freedom to control their children's education. People can't speak their mind without losing their jobs and things like that. This is worse than the McCarthy era. Where is that coming from? It's not coming from the right.
Which has now swept this country. It's infected. It has swept the Democratic Party. There is no question about it. The Democratic Party is hardly recognizable from just 10 years ago. Here's the deal. Progressives truly believe, and you can trace this all the way back to one of the founding fathers of progressivism, President Woodrow Wilson. They do not believe in a true separation of powers, the three branches of government. They don't want it. Nope. It's too inefficient, is what they'll say. It may have worked well when we were a small country in the early years under George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, back then we were infantile. May have worked then because it simply just takes too long to get stuff done nowadays because we're such a large country. We need to move quickly and nimbly. So that's what Woodrow Wilson began to do under his watch in the early 1900s. He introduced the bureaucracy, the various agencies who are truly now the ones who implement and oversee regulations in these new laws to control how we live our lives. Unelected bureaucrats. Wilson essentially wanted to tear down the constitutional republic for a more European style of governance, an incredibly powerful legislative branch that deferred to, quote, experts to determine what's best for you and me. And that's why we have these issues that pollsters identify as some of the top concerns for most Americans. Illegal immigration is a top issue. The economy and inflation are what voters are most concerned with. It's interesting, though, because Kaitlan Collins, in this exchange with Bill Barr, identifies what she and progressives believe to be, they believe to be the real threat to democracy, that Donald Trump is trying to subvert the will of the voters. Listen.
Those two things that you just noted there, you believe are worse than a president of the United States trying to subvert the will of the people by overturning the results of the election?
I think a country, all the things together, like we're not enforcing our borders, we have open borders, we have lawlessness in our cities, We have regulations coming fast and furious, so telling people what kind of stoves they can use and what kinds of cars they have to drive, and eliminating cars and so forth. Yeah, those are the threats to democracy.
First of all, this whole subverting the will of the voters is exactly what the Democrats did in 2016 and 2017. Democrats, many of them were voting to not certify the state electors back then. Did you know that? People like Jamie Raskin were so upset that Donald Trump won. He and many other progressive Democrats voted to not certify the election. The exact same thing Republicans, some of them, tried to do in 2021 on January 6th. Same thing. Also, not to mention the years-long, campaign by candidates who lost that election, namely Hillary Clinton, to delegitimize the candidate who won, who beat her as president. That's the same thing that she wanted an attempt, along with the media, to subvert the will of the voters by trying to get him out of office. So that whole argument is bunk. But to Bill Barr's point, the real threat to democracy is a stripping away of the freedoms that keep happening right before our very eyes, which for some reason many Americans can't seem to see. The government is supposed to decide which kind of car you can drive, how much companies are allowed to charge for their product or services, how much meat you're allowed to eat, what kind of grains and food farmers are allowed to grow, and what you are and are not allowed to say in public. You have government now actively trying to criminalize certain words and at the same time try to prevent parents from keeping their children from being allowed to see pornographic, and I've seen material in public libraries and in the schools. They call that a threat to democracy. Think about it. What was being chanted the other day in Dearborn? Death to America. Tear down this country. The entire thing. The institution of America has to be destroyed, is what they're chanting. What these terrorist sympathizers were saying wasn't any different than what Antifa was saying in 2020, or any different than what was subtly being said by progressive activists and politicians for more than 100 years. The American way has to be reformed, or it has to go. Woodrow Wilson was a big-time progressive with huge plans for reforming America. He preferred the way Germany did things. In portions of Europe, he didn't like the separation of powers. Give more power to the legislative branch to control things more was essentially his big idea, and he did that. For the people's own good, massive regulations on how citizens do things. You got to control the monetary system. So he signed into law the Federal Reserve Act back in 1913. He created a central bank and regulated the financial system. Put in a federal income tax, created minimum wage, 8-hour workdays. It all sounds good, but his prowess in forming public opinion convinced many that began to believe government should control things, not the people. He created the bureaucracy system, where the unelected were really the ones who created the laws, not the elected leaders and elected legislators. Elected lawmakers kind of became a front. They passed these general laws so the bureaucrats, the experts, could fine-tune them and create more restrictions. That's progressivism. So ask yourself, which party believes it has the answers to how we should live, what we should drive, what we should be allowed to say, in order to protect anyone from being offended by your words and protect you from things that they deem to be too dangerous for you to handle? In fact, which members of which party talk a lot about choice but predetermine the best choices for you regarding education, health care, what you eat, and how much you should pay someone based not on their merit but on an arbitrary or immutable trade within a disfavored industry? And which members of society should pay for the living costs of others? For now, there is a choice, and the decision for now is up to you. I'm Tom Jordan.